Hi, welcome to Byte Size Learning with Arts Access North Carolina. To celebrate Global Accessibility Awareness Day, we are joined by UX researcher and designer Deborah Lalush.
Hi, I'm Deborah Lalush. As Michaela said, I'm a UX designer and researcher, and I'm going to talk to you guys about UX today, especially as a disabled UX person. So this is me pretty early in design school. My major was actually in industrial design, which is more about physical products. And UX is a little bit more digital, but we'll get to that. Industrial design turned out to be a little less accessible for me because the sketching is a lot of throwing lines from the shoulder, and my joints didn't like that very much. So near the end of my degree, I sort of shifted more into UX. This is what my design studio desk looked like in industrial design school. You can see it's a lot of physical models, a lot of paper, a lot of physical prototypes. But again, it was just not as accessible for me. And then I also really liked the opportunities for including accessibility in my work through doing UX. But again, we'll get to that. I've gotten to do a lot of cool things and talk about UX and talk about access in front of a lot of people. And I'm really excited to get to share that with you guys today. So here's your quick intro to UX. What even is it? UX stands for user experience. It's usually associated with software and with websites, but it can stretch beyond tech. It's not just necessarily designing screens. UX can cover every stage of interaction that a user might have with a product. So that can go all the way from getting tech support for a thing you've already bought to figuring out how to purchase it in the first place. It's really every stage of interaction. Some specialties in UX, you'll hear UX design most of the time. That's usually used to refer to the whole discipline, actually. But UX design is more specifically, at least sometimes, just the part where you're creating the experience. UX research is just what it sounds like. It's a lot of the background stuff that goes into the final design, and it's a lot of user interaction stuff, interacting with users yourself and getting feedback. But again, we'll get to that. And then UX writing is a whole specific field that I don't do because it's a little beyond me. But UX writing is very particularly the text on the page or the text used in an interaction that makes sense to users, that makes the experience easier, and that still follows the voice of whatever brand or whatever website you're using. So it can be a very complicated thing, and I am not a writer myself. So I'm mostly just impressed by UX writers. It's not uncommon for one of these job titles to actually include more than one of them. Particularly UX design super often includes research in that job description, but it varies from position to position. Now, let's get into it a little bit deeper. The UX process. This is going to cover sort of that full range of research and design. Again, less of the writing, that's not so much my experience, but research and design. So let's go. research for UX. It's a lot of user interviews, user observation, and surveys just to get as much feedback from the people who will be using the product or who are already using it if you're redesigning something that exists, to make sure that the end experience is as usable and makes as much sense to the people using it as possible. Precedent and market research is just looking at what already exists that is at all similar to what you're creating and finding the patterns that are there. If there are any standards like icons that are always used for this particular kind of website or software, and figuring out what your competition is. What are you competing with? What do you need to be better than when you create this design? And what can you get inspiration from? Then there's user journey maps, app flows, and card sorting. And this is all figuring out the system, sort of the mechanism of the user experience that you're creating. It's figuring out how each piece is going to interact together. So a user journey is more of the entire experience for the user themselves. So that includes like logging into a website, how you get to the part of it that you need to get to, etc. App flows are more specifically a map of all the pages that you could be using. So app flows are a little bit more technical, whereas user journeys are a little bit softer and more based on the experience itself. And then card sorting is just taking literally index cards oftentimes and arranging them so you can figure out what titles make sense for pages, what sequence of links make sense to click. So you're not going to want to click on homepage and then also dashboard most of the time, because those often mean the same thing. So you're going to want to maybe rename something, and it helps you figure out those connections. I'll show you some of my own work. Most of this, I think all of it actually, is from college and university, because most of my professional work is still under NDAs. So I'll keep that one to myself for now. This is a map of all of the information that I got from 3 interviews and my extra precedent and market studies, and also just background research for a project where I was figuring out a product that would make sense to help international students that were coming to NC State. I got to talk to a visiting scholar from Japan, 2 students visiting from Taiwan, and 2 students that were from India. The bright red parts, as you can see on screen, are the things that came up frequently that I noticed coming up over and over. And so those were the things that I knew that I wanted to focus on in creating the later design for this. And maps like this are really useful for organizing your research. Now, this is from a totally different project. This was from a project from college when we were redoing the design of NC State's class registration program. And so this is the app flow for the website as it existed at the time. I don't know if it's changed, but this is how it was. And as you can see, it's very complicated. There are a lot of pieces and a lot of parts to go through to get to registering for classes and figuring all of that out. And so what I like to do is I make the existing app flow and then I scribble all over it. I make notes and I circle things and I scribble things out, and it helps me to organize how things could be as compared to how they are, and compare the questionable pieces and the things that don't make sense. If you see my giant question mark in the middle there, and I like to use different colors, as you can see, to kind of show which pieces go together and which pieces I'm using similar thought processes on, just to be able to keep track of my thoughts and come back to this later when I'm creating the next stage of app flows, which would be in the iteration process. This is basically design part one. It includes the redone app flows and sitemaps. So the newer version of the thing I just showed you. It could be paper prototyping and low fidelity wireframes. Paper prototyping is just what it sounds like. It is mocking up the site or the software that you're creating out of literal pieces of paper. And then low fidelity wireframes are just the very basic, bare bones outlines of where the pieces of the page are going to go and the text that might go there. Basic click-through prototypes are just those wireframes so that you can see what comes after what. And then A to B testing, which comes up later as well, is just comparing two designs, showing them to a user and getting their feedback on which one is better. Now, this is just what we were looking at. It's the redesigned app flow as I created it for my class registration project. This is a simpler, less chunky version of the original app flow. And so there's a lot less things to get through to be able to register for classes. So this is the result of my scribbling all over the original. And now this is a paper prototype. This is for that same project of class registration stuff. It is just outlines of things. A lot of these pieces, like the little bits, are sticky notes, so they would stay together. And this is just showing the expandable side panel that I was using. I also have this one so you can see the like pop-up window that would appear. I think paper prototypes are really fun. They're very interesting to interact with and move the pieces around, and they can give you a better idea of what's going to make sense later, because you do have to make it in layers and you have to see how the pieces interact, which makes sense later when you're trying to get it through development and interact with programmers that are making your final design. The next phase is the final designs, or design part two. This is the finalized app flows. So the reviewed and perfected version of that app flow I showed you, and then sitemaps, which are very one-to-one directly, here are all the pages on the site and where they go. They're similar, but usually formatted differently. And then high fidelity wireframes, which are the perfect, shiny, final version that you're going to want to put out on the market, as well as clickable full prototypes, which are all of your buttons work, all of your connections work. There are programs like Figma and Sketch where you can create these things without having to actually make the website yourself. And I like that a lot. I'm not going to show you any full finalized designs right now, but this is a style guide that I created for that same class enrollment project. It includes all of the assets that you're going to use. Assets are just the pieces that you put together in a UX design, basically. So it has all of the colors that could be used, all of the button options. I have icons out here, and then all of the fonts and font types and typefaces that will go into the final design. And this is great because you can pull directly from it. If you need a new color for a new section and you're not sure what to use, you reference your style guide and you know, okay, I have these 4 reds and oranges, I have these blues, this is the color I'm going to use here. It's very useful for making those finalized designs. And is that the end of the process? Of course not. You always have to do more research. There's always more user observation and interviews, comparing your final design to what the users actually want, more A to B testing for those high fidelity designs, comparing like, do I want to use this screen or this screen, putting them in front of a user and letting them choose. And then doing that also with elements. Like if you're not sure whether an icon makes sense, you can put a couple of different icons in front of a user and let them pick. And you get a better idea of what makes sense because you've been looking at this project for weeks, maybe months, and it's good to get an outside perspective. You also want to test all your clickable prototypes to make sure everything actually connects properly. And there's a lot of back and forth of working with developers to make sure your designs are even possible. Sometimes as a designer who is not a developer, you don't actually know what is going to make sense on the development side. So working with the developers to make sure everything is possible. And if it isn't, finding the best alternative that is close to your design but is possible to create can be a really important phase of the project. Now we'll get into my favorite part and the part that relates to Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is accessibility and disability. Like I mentioned, I'm disabled myself. I have an autoimmune arthritis. I have hypermobile joints. I have a couple of other things that accompany those, but those are the main ones. So I use a rollator sometimes, like in this picture, but I can put it aside if I need to. But that the personal experience of disability, I think, is really important in UX design. There aren't honestly that many designers that identify as disabled, but it's a huge asset to a designer to have that experience and that personal drive to focus on access, because it makes a big difference in the end. Accessibility is governed by the Web Compatibility Accessibility Guidelines, which unfortunately is often referred to as WCAG, even though I hate the sound of that. But the WCAG, as I prefer to say, tells you what you should do with your website to make it accessible. This is required for all government and government-funded websites to follow up to a certain level of the WCAG guidelines. And for government-funded sites, that can be anything from a public university's website, because they're government-funded, to sometimes financial institutions, a lot of them, and more than that. But it's only required for the government-associated things generally, or only legally required that way. But the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is just w3.org, has the full text of the current version of WCAG, as well as the draft of the next version, which is currently public and active. And I think they're accepting commentary and suggestions for that new draft for the next version, which is very cool. I personally prefer, if I need to reference WCAG or if I'm trying to teach someone about it, I go to this website. It's called WebAIM, or WebAIM, which stands for Web Accessibility in Mind. They have so many good resources, and the way that they break down the WCAG into a checklist is so much more useful than trying to comb through official governmental texts. It breaks it down like this into, here are the things, here is each piece that you need to meet to make it accessible. And this is a great reference for designers who aren't necessarily working on a website that needs to be legally accessible, but they just want to include that in their process, which is becoming more and more important. The WebAIM website also has a really good intro to web accessibility page that breaks down disability as it comes to interacting with tech into 4 categories of visual, auditory, motor, which is like movement, physical, and then cognitive, which is your brain, how your brain works. And this makes it a lot easier to sort of process how individual groups are going to interact with your website, with your software. Obviously, it's not necessarily the most thorough, covering each individual disability, but it's very good for understanding sort of general groups of it as a whole and how accessibility is going to affect them. There is also a course called the Trusted Tester. It's a certification provided by the government, and it's free. I've been taking this course, actually. I'm almost done with it. So I have an official certification, even though I've been doing accessibility stuff for a long time. And it's super useful. I know this will look good on my resume. And the course is super thorough. So I'll be a certified accessibility tester very soon. Let me back up a tiny bit from this page. So the ADA is access for buildings and physical spaces, right? But most people are familiar with the fact that the ADA is kind of the minimum. It's bare bones. It's what you need to make something start to be accessible. Like, there's not necessarily requirements for terrain on ramps. So if you're in a wheelchair trying to get into a building, the ramp could be cobblestone, which is very hard to get over, but it can still meet the ADA requirements. And similar to that, the WCAG doesn't necessarily cover everything to make something the most usable and inclusive. But again, the draft for the next version is public, and I think they're accepting commentary. So that's great. They're getting better. But what I like to do to try to include a little bit more thorough usability is heuristic analysis. This is basically going through a website, observing the whole thing for usability and access. There are a lot of ways to do this. My favorite one is to take screenshots and draw all over them, kind of like I do with app flows. It just makes it easier to process for me, and it makes it easier to reference later. So let me show you one of those. This is again for a self-driven project. This is not something I was paid for and can't show you. But I was going through this website to figure out usability as well as access. A lot of this is just usability focused, so it's less specific to sensory access or whatever. So a lot of these notes are about how the words make sense, because that's a big part of usability and even access. Is if the heading of a page doesn't tell you what's on it, it's not going to be very usable. So the red on this page is my general observations, and then the green and the purple are actually personas, where I developed out a person that might use this site and put down what I would assume their commentary would be. So that can be really useful for figuring out how different kinds of people approaching a page in a different way might need it to change to be more usable. And I love doing these, just scribbling all over a page. That might be my favorite part of UX, to be honest. So the more you know about accessibility, the more inclusive the UX will be. Oftentimes in the professional world, accessibility is an afterthought. It's popped in at the end of the process. And because of that, a lot of companies would rather pass over it because it costs too much and they don't want to put in the effort. But if you understand the basics of accessibility, or even better, a more thorough version of how accessibility works on the web, then you can kind of insert it in at every phase. If needs for accessibility are in your research, are in your early designs, then there's no way for them to back up and try to remove it. There's no way to separate it from the product. And that's really important, and it makes a huge difference in how usable and how accessible your product will be in the end.
Thank you so much for being here. And we have a couple questions for a short Q&A.
Cool.
The first question was, what first drew you into the world of design or industrial design?
So actually, when I was in 4th grade, a design professor from NC State came and talked to my 4th grade class about industrial design and product design. And I stopped listening halfway through her presentation because I was sketching on the borders and the margins of my page, and I was just enthralled by it. As a kid, I really wanted to be an inventor, and these things are as close as I could get to something like that, which was very cool. But that professor ended up being one of my interviewers to get into design school. And then the professor that was my advocate and go-to person throughout design school, I might not have made it through without her. So that was a very cool connection.
That's awesome. Our other question was, what advice would you give to other disabled designers who may just be starting out in the field?
I would have to say, stand your ground and fight for yourself. A lot of times, I think designers in particular, and this is not a criticism of anyone in particular, but I think the general culture of design is a lot of, we create designs for people with disabilities, rather than considering that people with disabilities could be doing design. And I found that a lot even in design school. Some professionals, some professors sometimes would realize that I needed to do things at a different pace, or that I had a disability, and they would just sort of freeze up because they don't know what to do when you're on the same level as them. But if you stand your ground and you just explain what you need, and you don't let anyone push back on that too much, that makes a big difference. And finding other disabled designers, honestly. I tried to when I was in school, and I had a really hard time. I think a lot of designers who might identify as disabled don't, because of that idea that of design is for disability and it's our client and our user only. But now I've been doing work with the IDSA, ironically, which is the Industrial Design Society of America, even though I do UX. But industrial to UX is a pretty common pipeline, so it's not that weird. There's a few of us in there. But we founded the Disability and Design section this year. And so I have a great little club of other disabled designers that I can talk to if I need even advice or just someone to talk to. And it's been really great and validating and just a very good time to have them around, because it's just nice to have people that share the experience that you have. So find other disabled designers, honestly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Community makes such a big difference in so many different ways.
It really does.
Well, thank you again for being here. Your talk was really great, and we're so happy we could have you on.
Thank you.